Good afternoon. I'm Raleigh Flynn. I'm the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank based in Philadelphia. For those of you who are new to us, this is part of our FPRI University of Delaware First State series, a series we started last fall. And today we're going to be talking about climate, competition, and collaboration in the Arctic sea lanes, a vital topic of growing and considerable interest. Our moderator today will be Dr. Saleem Ali, and our featured panelists are Dr. Rebecca Pincus, Dr. Anthony Strawa, and Dr. Roman Sidortsov. Dr. Saleem Ali is our host today and moderator, and for those of you who don't know him, he's an environmental security scholar whose research and practice focuses on ways of resolving ecological conflicts through technical and social mechanisms and exploring peace-building methods between corporations, governments, and communities. He holds the Blue and Gold Distinguished Professorship in Energy and the Environment at University of Delaware. He's also a senior fellow at Columbia University Center on Sustainable Investment. I'd also like to mention his books, which are Treasures of the Earth, Need, Greed, and a Sustainable Future, Environmental Diplomacy, Islam and Education, Conflict and Conformity in Pakistan's Madrasas. A few notes for our audience. We will be taking your questions, so please put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Ideally not in the chat box because we'll miss them potentially if you put them in there. So use the Q&A box. Also, we'll be showing, we'll have some links to maps of the Arctic in our chat box. So finally, before we get started, I want to give a special thank you to our sponsors and members and our board members who are on this event today. We welcome you and thank you. For those of you who are not yet members or contributors, we always like to remind you that these events are open and free to the public, but they're not free to us. So we always welcome your support. Without further ado, Dr. Saleem Ali.
Greetings, colleagues. It's a pleasure to welcome you on this Tuesday afternoon here in Delaware, where we're trying to navigate the Arctic as we move from winter to spring, and as the ice thaws in the Arctic, new charts of navigation open up. The topic is very relevant. As you may have heard, just recently there was a maritime crisis in the Suez Canal. And this may seem very distant from the Arctic, but you would be surprised perhaps to find out that it was an opportunity used by many of the Arctic powers to call for greater investment in opening the navigation in the Arctic Sea. So as with climate change, as the ice thaws, there may be other routes that could be possible for maritime traffic. Of course, we also keep hearing about conflict in the Arctic and not having a mechanism to manage such conflict. And then seeking opportunities for cooperation. What can be ways forward whereby we could have nascent organizations like the Arctic Council move towards some sense of greater global governance. So our discussion today, we're delighted that we have three eminent scholars who have studied this topic from various perspectives. And I'm going to introduce them all together now, and then each of them may want to also say something more specific about their current activities. So our first speaker will be Anthony Strawa, who has had a distinguished career with NASA at the Ames Research Center in California. He's currently chief scientist for a new organization called SecureTheFuture2100.org. He's going to give us a more panoramic view of the situation. After that, we're going to move on to Roman Sidortsov, who is on the faculty of Michigan Technological University. He is a scholar of particularly Russia's role in the Arctic, but he has worked across the Arctic region. He's going to give us that perspective and share some slides as well regarding his work in Russia. He's recently also received a major grant from the European Union, along with Benjamin Sovacool, around energy policy issues in the Arctic, and he may say some words about that. And then finally, we will have a perspective on the situation with reference to the US, particularly from Dr. Rebecca Pincus, who is on the faculty of the US Naval War College in Rhode Island. And she and I worked together on a book some years ago titled Diplomacy on Ice, which was published by Yale University Press. And we looked at, it was an anthology which looked at different opportunities for cooperation around the Arctic. And Rebecca is going to give the perspectives also from the point of view of training future Navy officers and what should be our way forward within the US as we navigate the Arctic. So with that introduction, let me hand it over to Anthony Strawa to give us some opening remarks. Each of the speakers will have about 7 minutes for opening remarks, and then we will engage in a conversation. Thank you. Tony, over to you.
Okay, can you hear me, Saleem? Yes? Okay,
yes,
great.
Very good, thank you.
Thank you, Saleem, for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here and discuss this important and timely topic with you all. The threat to US national security is seen not only in the changing geopolitical situation in the region, but also in Arctic's role in global warming that's threatening infrastructure, food and water security, regionally and in the Northern Hemisphere in general. More than any other place on Earth, the Arctic is a rapidly changing environment. Arctic region is warming at least twice as fast as the rest of the planet, a phenomenon known as Arctic amplification. And the unfavorable feedback mechanisms that contribute to Arctic amplification are making the Arctic warming not only a consequence, but also a driver of climate change. In most simulations, the Arctic Ocean becomes practically sea ice free in September for the first time in 2050. Similar warming is decreasing ice cover on land, melting glaciers, and thawing permafrost. Thawing permafrost and erosion due to sea level rise are threatening 14 indigenous communities in Alaska alone, disrupting local economies and threatening the flora and fauna in the region. 70% of Arctic infrastructure is built on permafrost, and the cost of even a part of this infrastructure being damaged could run into the hundreds of billions of dollars and do incomparable economic harm. As an example is the collapse last year of the crude oil storage tank in Norilsk that sent 150,000 barrels of oil towards the Arctic Ocean. Arctic warming affects both regional and global climate. The effect of Arctic amplification have been linked to severe weather in the Northern Hemisphere, such as droughts and severe weather. The global cost of climate-related disasters in a 2-year period, 2016 through 2018, is estimated to be $650 billion. Munich Re, the world's largest reinsurance firm, blamed climate change for $24 billion worth of losses in the California wildfires during those years. In 2020, wildfires in Siberia burned an area larger than Greece, sending CO2 into the atmosphere and toxic smoke to nearby communities. There's also the potential for catastrophic releases of methane and other greenhouse gases from the Arctic seabed and thawing permafrost that could greatly accelerate the warming of the planet. Arctic warming and the loss of sea ice is also threatening to upend the balance of power in the region. Russia has laid claim to more Arctic lands and seas than any other country as part of its exclusive economic zone, recently extending its claim to 70% of the central Arctic Ocean seabed. They now have overlapping claims in the Arctic Ocean with most members of the Arctic Council. Moscow is moving aggressively to expand and secure its position in the Arctic with the buildup of existing bases and construction of new bases. These include advanced defensive systems to support their anti-access area denial strategy. Russia has some 40 icebreakers. That's more than the rest of the world combined. Russia is set to assume the chairmanship of the Arctic Council in May of this year, and Russian senior Arctic official Mr. Vasilyev has recently written several articles in the Arctic Circle Journal that outline their ambitions in the Arctic. These ambitions focus on economic development, increasing Russia's military presence in the region, increased oil and liquid natural gas extraction, and expanding the Northern Sea Route. China also has declared itself a near Arctic country with equal rights to develop the region's resources and participate in regional governance. Beijing is acquiring a fleet of icebreakers for use in the Arctic and is pursuing many projects in the region, collaborating with member states of the Arctic Council. In particular, Russian and Chinese companies are jointly exploring offshore territories for oil and gas exploitation and expanding Chinese commercial navigation through the Northern Sea Route. Exploiting Arctic shipping and resources will require substantial investments in infrastructure, drilling technology, environmental and safety protection, and contribute to the warming of the planet. The cost of damages due to this climate change will be felt by all nations, including those that do not benefit from the short-term economic gains of extraction and shipping. The IPCC says that we must reduce greenhouse gas emissions dramatically and develop carbon capture and storage technologies at scale to reach even the modest goals set by the Paris Accords. We must ask ourselves two questions. Is the short-term economic benefit from exploiting Arctic oil and mineral reserves worth the long-term damage of Arctic-related climate change? And is it wise to be investing in these technologies to extract more fossil fuels when we need to be investing heavily into reducing our consumption of fossil fuels? In the waning days of the Trump administration, the Department of Homeland Security, DoD, and military commands released new Arctic strategies, but these did not even mention climate change. With these things in mind, the U.S. should develop coherent and consistent Arctic policy across all agencies that emphasize the impact of climate change in the region and the Arctic's role in driving climate change. Work with the Arctic Council to commit to environmentally responsible behavior, the preservation of indigenous communities and local flora and fauna, and build a better legal framework to address the risks of increased operations in the Arctic, and ratify the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony, yes, for that very useful introduction to the topic from also a natural science perspective, covering some of the issues that are quite imminent. Now we'll move on to Roman Sidortsov, who is going to share a few slides, especially focused on energy development in the Arctic. So Roman, over to you.
Thank you very much, Saleem, for the introduction. And thank you very much, the organizers, for inviting me to participate in this panel. It is my absolute pleasure to be here. I could not have thought of a better entry into this conversation than Dr. Strawa's presentation, because especially the ending of his remarks, when he mentioned the energy development, fossil fuel development in the region in particular, and the monumental problem that we're dealing with, which is the climate crisis. So it just happens that the conflict between these two processes, or these two movements, I should say, is what really brought me into the Arctic. Because you probably, some of you recall the headlines saying, quoting often the often misquoted study by U.S. Geological Survey promising or referring to vast potential resources in the region and the ongoing projects. Yet at the same time, this was all happening against the backdrop of the emergent threats posed by climate change. So I started looking into the Arctic, and that actually brought me into the Russian Arctic. I am originally from Russia, from actually Siberia, not the Arctic, but subarctic. So it was home for me. And in the current project that Saleem mentioned, we are looking at the ethics of sustainable development in the Arctic. And one of the work packages, as he mentioned, focuses on the energy transition, focuses on the energy policy. So without further ado, I would like to focus my remarks on the current situation with the energy plans and current energy production that Russia has. And I will try to look at it from the standpoint of the energy development, where the energy transition, where the world appears to be headed towards decarbonization, and then identify the potential pitfalls for diplomatic relations and associated with Russia assuming chairmanship of the Arctic Council. So I'm going to blitz really through this this first three or four slides, because really just to give you the context of the projected or planned development in the Russian Arctic. And this one is taken from this map, and I apologize to callers. I'll try to describe this to the extent I can. So basically, this slide depicts the plans for Russian national oil company Rosneft regarding their expansion of oil and gas development offshore in the Arctic offshore. The following slide, and there are projects lined up and areas lined up everywhere from the Barents Sea all the way to the Chukchi Sea. The next slide depicts the plans of somewhat of a rival state company called Gazprom, and this one is Gazprom Neft, so the branch of the Russian natural gas giant that focuses on oil development. Also, several projects are depicted on it, several Arctic projects are depicted on it, albeit mostly in the European and Western Siberian, or the western part of Siberia in the Arctic. So the following slide also shows the expansion of the existing production of Gazprom's core business, which is natural gas production and transportation, and a series of planned trunk gas pipeline. The next one is not a state company, but a closely affiliated entity called Navatech. And this is the depiction of the projects that Navatech currently has in the Yamal Peninsula. Most remarkable, the Yamal LNG and Arctic LNG 2, along with 70 licenses that Navatech currently holds for natural gas development. So what are beyond this plants and plant activities? Well, quite a few actually. So just to quickly go through the main areas, right? So Russia does have a working offshore oil field in the Arctic, really the first proper offshore field in the Arctic ever. The Yamal LNG is an ongoing project. First shipment was delivered in 2017. The South Kara Sea project was a joint venture between Rosneft and ExxonMobil, resulted in a purported discovery, rather large discovery. So also Dr. Strawa mentioned the strategy, the Russian Arctic strategy for the period ending in 2035. I do believe this is the direct translation of the document. So, and one of the key points of that is the massive expansion of hydrocarbon exploration and extraction in the Arctic. And just to give you an idea of how massive it is projected that the production, LNG production, will grow 10 times by 2035. That's where the Russian Federation would like to be. Now, going back in time. So is this any new? It isn't. So here's the map, or no, here's a table rather that shows the discovered field in the Arctic and to what extent this discovered field have been in production. So Russia actually put into production 43 discovered fields that were discovered as early as in the 50s, 60s, and so forth. So in a way, Arctic is not really a new energy frontier. It is essentially a backyard, if you would. So here's the depiction of the production, the current production, not the current 2016, as of 2016, of oil and gas development from the Russian Arctic and subarctic. I tallied these numbers and I came up with 77% of Russia's oil coming from the Arctic or subarctic, and as much as 95% coming from the Arctic and subarctic. Now, what kind of development is the new development? Unlike the old development that was developed essentially at the expense of Soviet taxpayers and massive government programs, the new development goes into the places where oil and gas are much harder to find. So what are we talking about? So what's the formula for this new development, for where the country appears to be headed? So we are talking about very, very expensive projects, long-term investment between 20 and 50 years. We're talking about high cost. So the main difference between what is producing right now and what is projected to produce, high cost. There are other, but the main other difference, but the main really difference is really, really high cost, both oil and gas. So it is possible that the third wave of development, the second wave of development is materializing right now. So it's a bit of a wave, but the third wave of development that counts on some of the undiscovered resources probably might not even happen now. So now a few words really about where we're at with the oil production. Well, 2020 was a really bad year for the oil and gas sector, more so for oil than for gas. We have seen some rebounding of the Russian producers, but again, so where it will go and whether we actually have reached peak oil is a real question. So the prospects of where this oil is actually and all this gas go, especially the long-term prospects, are less than certain. So now try to position this against the what is next, what the position of the Russian Federation might be. So these things are worth considering. So there's already in the discourse of key Russian policymakers, we see some concern for the market. Right, so will there be a market for all these hydrocarbons? I question that there will be. Two, when we frame the issue of security and security for Russia, it is easy to, and I think it's a valuable thing to, an easy thing to frame it as the security of demand. Russia would like to secure demand for its hydrocarbons. So other interests need to be taken into account. Yes, we are dealing with two state giants, but there are also private interests within those companies. And that needs to be taken into consideration. And finally, these advertised projects, these plans also need to be understood through the prism of stranded assets. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Roman, and for making this very current with regard to the situation with Russia. So now from Moscow to Newport, I guess, Rhode Island, we're delighted to welcome Rebecca Pincus, who's going to give us the US perspective, but certainly more broadly, as well. She has worked in other parts of the world. She was a Fulbright scholar in Iceland. And if I can take some pride, she was also one of my PhD graduates when I had the pleasure of being her PhD advisor. So over to you, Rebecca.
Thank you so much, Saleem. Great to be here. Thanks for that wonderful introduction. And these previous two speakers have said so much, and I know we're approaching the halfway mark, so I'll try to keep my remarks fairly limited so we can get right to the discussion. At the outset, I do need to note that while I am a professor at the Naval War College, I am sharing my personal opinions with you, and I am not presenting the official views of the Navy or the Department of Defense. With that said, I think I might take a couple of minutes to sketch out some prospects for the next few years, because we're at such an interesting time in Arctic relations right now. As you noted at the outset, Saleem, Russia is about to assume the chair of the Arctic Council, which is the major intergovernmental forum in the Arctic. We have a new US administration that has done a pretty significant change in priorities and direction. And so I think this is a good time to think about what our prospects might be over the next couple of years. So at the outset, I would say that I would think, and we have sort of weak signals at this point, but I would think that we should expect a period of relative stability in the Arctic over the next couple of years. The Biden administration has signaled a few clear pointers about its direction. The first one of those is a return to traditional diplomacy. And that has been very clear in all of the guidance and in the behaviors that have been initiated under this new administration. So we see explicit statements about a return to institutions, to diplomatic norms and conventions, to consultations with allies and partners. And we're seeing that even in basic practices like the return of daily press briefings at the State Department, for example. So with the upcoming Arctic Council Ministerial in May, hosted by Iceland, I think we'll see a fairly smooth transition to the Russian chairmanship. And I think we also will see significant cooperation and discussion within the Arctic Council and other fora on climate change. The Biden-Harris administration has made it clear that climate is a top priority. Biden issued an executive order last month directing all federal agencies to engage on climate change, and this is clearly a major push. Obviously, that will be a central plank of engagement on the Arctic region. And I think that offers a pathway forward for cooperation, given that the Russian program for their chairmanship also speaks at length about the importance of engaging on climate change, clean energy, and sustainable development. So I think we do see some room for cooperation, both between the US and Russia directly, and also among the Arctic Council states. We also see that the Biden administration has prioritized strategic competition with China. And so I think that gives us an indication of the administration's priorities and where their focus may be. And there may be some interesting discussions about how to welcome China into the Arctic region and what guideposts may be collectively erected by the Arctic states to ensure that China is a cooperative partner that helps advance shared objectives in the region rather than undermining progress. So I think that will be an interesting area for discussions moving forward. I think I would note that there are significant global challenges right now that might make the Arctic more of a backseat issue. As Roman noted, the interest in developing Arctic resources, the price of oil and gas has really been bouncing around a lot, and there is not a sustained enough market demand right now to justify moving forward on a lot of these projects. And that's not just Russian projects. We're seeing that in Greenland, in Canada, and in some of the other Arctic states where development has been slower than anticipated. So we have a moment now where the market is not pushing these projects forward particularly fast. The world is distracted not only by the COVID pandemic and the associated economic dislocation that has caused, but by other priorities, including climate change. And so I think we do have a moment now to make progress, to build consensus, and to work together through the Arctic Council on some of these issues of common concern. Obviously, COVID is a major concern in the Arctic, particularly in the less developed parts of the Arctic, notably in Alaska, northern Canada, perhaps part of Russia, where infrastructure gaps and healthcare gaps make local communities extremely vulnerable. And so that remains an ongoing challenge that is likely to persist at least through this year, if not into next. So we see top priorities where there is certainly room for cooperation. And we also know that the US and Russia have a strong track record of cooperation, even during periods of deep geopolitical tension. So even this January, we saw the US and Russian Coast Guards conduct joint maritime border patrols in the Bering Sea. And that's a sign of practical cooperation being achievable, even in the context of a fairly high level of geopolitical tension. So I think that's encouraging, and I imagine we'll see more of that moving forward. The last point I want to make is that the last couple of years have showed us clear examples of some of the really significant shared challenges faced by all Arctic nations. And Tony highlighted a few of those. Not only the dangers of melting permafrost for onshore infrastructure, like that Norilsk spill, but also the danger of tsunamis. We saw the Greenlandic tsunami just a couple of years ago, linked to permafrost thaw, triggering landslides that caused an incredibly destructive tsunami. And so we know natural disasters are likely to increase with increased warming. And we also know that there's a high chance of human and environmental disaster as maritime traffic picks up. And so that's why I'd also like to draw attention to the important work that the Arctic Coast Guard Forum is doing. The Arctic Coast Guard Forum is sort of parallel to the Arctic Council. It's an organization of the Arctic Coast Guards that works to build cooperation and coordination on issues like environmental protection and maritime search and rescue. And Russia will also be taking the chair of the Arctic Coast Guard Forum because the chair of that organization rotates in tandem with the Arctic Council. So I think we see a really interesting window coming up where, as Russia chairs these two major organizations, and as we see signals about sort of an emphasis on traditional diplomacy from the Biden administration, there may be room for limited cooperation on issues of mutual importance. And I think that's very promising. And I'm looking forward to seeing what the next couple of years bring. But I do think there's some room to take sort of an alternate approach to the sort of fear-mongering that is so prevalent these days. But I look forward to the thoughts from our audience. I see we have a lot of questions coming in. So I'll wrap up there. And again, looking forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Becca. With regard to the questions, the panelists are welcome to also answer some of them in text, if you like. We will try to get as many of them covered in plenary form, but some of them are sort of micro questions that may be appropriate to answer. So since, one of the questions that has come up is with regard to China, and it's been noted that China has declared itself an Arctic power, but just to link with the maritime issue, it's also clear that if there was to be an opening of the Arctic maritime route, China would have to invest heavily in the Arctic ports in Russia. And there has been a rapprochement between China and Russia recently. And I'm wondering if any of the panelists can comment on the China-Russia alliance, whether it is for oil and gas sales or for ports development, with regard to the maritime route as well, because the biggest traffic would be from Shanghai to Hamburg or Rotterdam. It's not going to be from Vladivostok to Hamburg. So, what would be the thoughts of, especially Roman and Becca, particularly if you looked into that question?
Roman, I'll defer to you.
Yes, go ahead, Becca. Yes.
Well, I mean, I thought that the last part was about the ports, and ports, I believe, is firmly in your jurisdiction, Becca.
Well, I guess my sort of quick thought is that we have certainly seen some sort of limited cooperation between China and Russia on energy projects along the Northern Sea Route and on shipping. COSCO has done some shipping through the NSR, and we've seen the Chinese State Investment Fund and also the Silk Road Fund invest in Yamal. They have, I think, a 30% combined stake in Yamal. And then I think, Roman, correct me, but I think about a 20% in LNG too. And so there's some small investments, but those are also diversified investment portfolios. So France's Total is an investor. I believe there's some Japanese funding as well. And I think, there's clearly some interest on the part of China. It's a major energy importer. It's the world's largest shipper, but it's clear that the Northern Sea Route is not a practical alternative to traditional shipping routes, and there was sort of a lot of buzz while the Suez was closed, but the Northern Sea Route has not only significant weather challenges, including sea ice hazards that are quite dangerous. It still is not fully developed in terms of infrastructure. From a maritime safety perspective, there's some really outstanding questions about insurance regulations, and there are draft limitations. So the NSR is useful for some shipping types of activities, but those are primarily, those are fairly limited, and it has some significant barriers to ever being a full-fledged route, competing in the sort of just-in-time shipping model that currently dominates global shipping. So it's certainly not a practical alternative anytime soon. And so I think while there has been some limited Chinese interest, we haven't seen as much practical cooperation as we've seen buzz, right? So there's been a lot of chatter about this, but actual sort of shovel-ready projects are relatively limited. That may have to do with what's going on in world resource markets right now. There's been a lot of price volatility. I would say that the Russian regulatory system in the NSR has moved around a fair amount. And so there's probably been some practical business impediments to more fully fleshed out cooperation. But again, I'd love to hear, Roman, your thoughts on this.
Yeah, this is great, because when it comes to shipping, I'm learning, and this is a great opportunity for me to learn. So if I am to take a semi-educated guess, it would be that whatever the cooperation occurs, it's occurring and will continue to occur on increasingly China-friendly terms. Right, so I unfortunately didn't look at the projections for demand for energy demand in China going forward, but that would have been actually a great point from which to answer this question. But assuming that China continues to electrify, assuming that it continues to do both, continue building coal-fired power plants that produce electricity, right? So, and increase its renewable energy development, renewable electricity development. We are looking at an increasingly electrified country, which means that the need for hydrocarbons, whether they are oil, gas, whether they come from Saudi Arabia or Russia, it puts certain limitations on that market. So do I think that it's possible that China will continue to diversify their sources for oil and gas? Absolutely. Is it possible? Is it likely that they will include some Arctic projects? Yes, likely, yes, it will be, because this is where the Russian new capacity is projected to occur. Will it be on a, say, meteoritic, earth-shattering scale? I don't think so. So, and all of that is also is to happen against the backdrop of a worldwide electrification of mobility. So proliferation of EVs, proliferation of public transit, electrification of public transit. So we are seeing a dwindling market for Russian oil and gas. And again, this is an opportunity for China to go and essentially impose really favorable terms. Also, China has lots of cash, and getting cash for this kind of projects is getting increasingly harder. So again, so this is where, if I were to identify a trend, this is what the trend would be.
Okay. Now there's the question which maybe Tony might want to comment on, is around, with climate change, you are going to see agricultural productivity open up in the Arctic potentially as well. You know, Canada has, for example, stated they want 100 million people population by 2100. That means not all of them are going to live in Vancouver and Toronto, thankfully. So we have to think about, you know, what's the prospect of this agricultural development in the Arctic, and how there could be new opportunities from a climate change perspective. You know, no, we recognize all the negative side of the impacts, but could there be that positive dividend?
So, yeah, I don't know that much about the agricultural opportunities, particularly in Canada. I know that because of climate change and the severe heat that areas in the Arctic have been experiencing, there's been a lot more wildfires in Siberia and Canada. They've been a lot more widespread. And I would think that would be a counterbalance to any kind of agriculture that you can produce over there. You know, I don't see. I think it's going to be a real difficult balancing act to try and get economic development in these areas in terms of agriculture or, you know, shipping and things like that, and balance that against the damages that are being caused by climate change. And we're talking about, you know, many hundreds of billions of dollars globally, and in the Arctic also many billions of dollars of damages. And so, you know, the economic benefit that you get from doing something like trying to promote agriculture has to be weighed against that.
Okay, thank you, Tony. There are several questions on Greenland. You know, of course, Greenland was in the headlines when former President Trump offered to buy the territory from Denmark, which was rejected by the Danes and I presume by the Greenlanders themselves. But there seems to be interest in rare earth mining there. That's an area of research I've been involved in quite a bit, and we have a faculty member at University of Delaware, Julie Klinger, who works on rare earths. A lot of us have been looking into this, but is there something about Greenland that is worth noting? There's a question also that there's a political change in Greenland happening. Apparently the parliament was elected today, and the Chinese are influencing some of the activities there. So any comments on Greenland, this vast frontier that's opening up?
I would be happy to weigh in. Yes, there is an election in Greenland right now, which is very interesting. And one of the major issues is the Kvanefjeld mine proposal, which is a rare earth and uranium mine in southern Greenland. And there has been quite a bit of debate in the country about the sort of costs and benefits of developing mining projects like that. Obviously, there's a fair amount of revenue, which is very promising, and Greenland is currently relies on an annual transfer from Copenhagen. Greenland is part of the Kingdom of Denmark, and so the Danish government sends Greenland funds every year, and the more sort of local resource development Greenlanders can initiate, the closer they get towards independence, which is a long-standing goal. But on the other hand, the mine will have significant environmental consequences. Rare earth mining is very environmentally destructive. And you know, the vast majority of the Greenland's population is Inuit, and subsistence food practices are an important part of their food security. And so there's tremendous debate. It's not at all clear if that mine will end up being approved. It'll be interesting to see what this election brings us. And there has been there's been a lot of talk about Greenland as sort of a pawn in great power competition, because it has this expressed wish for independence, and it is a very small microstate. And so there has been a lot of talk, but I would say that while there were several proposals for Chinese investment into a couple of strategic projects in Greenland, many of those have not come to fruition. The extent of Chinese investment at present is quite limited. There's a fish processing plant in Nuuk with Chinese ownership, and there's some other Chinese investments in the fish processing sector, which is a major part of the Greenlandic economy. There is a consulate, but the idea that China has sort of wrapped its tentacles around Greenland is quite far from the truth. And the last couple of years have seen a pretty significant effort on the part of Copenhagen to work more closely with Greenlandic leaders in partnership to talk through some of the questions associated with Chinese investment in things like fiber optic cables and communications and others. And so I think to a certain extent, we see a little bit of very smart triangulation on the part of Greenland. You know, it's using sort of the specter of Chinese investment to extract more benefits from Copenhagen. I think that's quite clever of them and to be expected. And you know, it shows us sort of the unusual side effects of this sort of great power competition era. But I do think that we have probably, I don't want to say this for sure, but you know, the initial sort of wave of Chinese interest and investment pressure around the Arctic seems to have receded a little bit in the last year or two. I think we're at a little bit of a lull. It will be interesting to see what the next wave looks like, but obviously there's much greater awareness and sort of savvy at this point. And so I don't think that the sort of worst projections are going to come true. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Becca. There are some questions which the panelists may want to answer in text. There's one about the HARP program closing that has a history of all kinds of other conspiracy theories and linkages to climate change and so on. But you know, if there's any strategic aspect to HARP closure, we can talk about it plenary, or people can just respond in the chat. The other question I should mention that I think does deserve some airtime perhaps pertains to the Bering Straits and US-Russian cooperation in the Bering. You know, there's a long history, of course, of Alaska and Russia in terms of our purchase of Alaska from Russia, but then also there's been the Bering Land Bridge National Park Service collaboration with the Russian environmental conservation authorities. There was a joint research and grant program for Russian and American environmental scientists, which has been in abeyance. Is there something that we should be developing further on the Bering in terms of also literally thawing the relations between US and Russia, which are also at an all-time low, some would argue, since the end of the Cold War? Is there an opportunity for some US-Russian détente? Roman, I'm putting to you.
All right, so I'm going to start, and then we're actually going to ask. I'm going to redirect this inquiry to the real expert, which would be Becca. So the way I see the future of cooperation in general, there really isn't that much left, unfortunately, between Russia and the United States to cooperate on. So the Arctic is this still open channel of finding the common interests and collaborating on them. And the Bering Strait being an important navigation channel presents this opportunity where the interests can be aligned. So this can be actually one of those collaborative initiatives that hopefully will grow and will continue, you know, maybe reversing some of the current trends where those opportunities for collaboration and diplomacy are all but disappearing.
So,
now,
Becca, are you as pessimistic as well, or Tony, about US-Russian relations?
I am an optimist. I'm an eternal optimist. I was working for the US Coast Guard a few years ago when the US Coast Guard and its Russian counterparts successfully negotiated a joint agreement on vessel routing in the Bering Strait and submitted it to the IMO as a joint proposal. And so I think that is an example of the sort of practical cooperation that is sort of outside of the spotlight. It doesn't get a lot of attention, but because it's sort of outside of that spotlight, it's able to continue even under the context of, as you say, pretty significant tension. And I think while I would agree with Roman that the scope for cooperation is narrow, I think that there is room to build upon that. And I think, you know, if we just had a few years of stability and sort of low-level cooperation, I think that would give us a foundation to perhaps build upon in the future. I would say that's sort of what we should expect going forward, relatively limited cooperation. But, you know, on things like maritime search and rescue, on fisheries enforcement in the Bering, on fisheries enforcement, you know, in the Central Arctic Ocean. You know, all the Arctic states are signatories of the moratorium on fishing in the Central Arctic Ocean. Enforcement of that is going to require cooperation. I think there is some more room for the US and Russia to work together with other Arctic states on issues like protecting fisheries, preserving human life, and protecting the marine environment. And again, that is the sort of soft security that is shared. It's a shared interest. There are strong community links across the Bering Strait. As you noted, Saleem, there are national parks in place and strong cultural ties. And those are all relatively, I think, safe areas for cooperation, as long as they, you know, do not become politicized. So I'm cautiously optimistic that we'll see some more of that in the next few years. And the increasing rates of vessel traffic make it all the more important to advance cooperation on environmental protection, search and rescue, and cultural stewardship.
Great, thank you, Becca. There is a very specific question, Roman, for you about some bases that are being reconstructed. You may want to answer that on the chat with Wrangell Island and so on. Tony, to you, a question that has been posed is around the marshes in the Arctic, which are going to potentially release methane and cause a positive feedback loop. And what are your views on finding ways to mitigate that?
Yeah, I think that's a real important point, and it kind of follows on to your last question there. You know, the Arctic Council has had a really good track record of cooperation on areas of mutual interest. And one of the areas that I think both is of interest to the US and Russia is understanding better the permafrost and exactly how much methane and other greenhouse gases are contained in the permafrost, how these things might be put into the atmosphere with the thawing of the permafrost, and also the methane hydrates on the Arctic Ocean seabed as the Arctic Ocean is warming. And you're losing the ice cover there. A lot of the methane can bubble up and also be emitted into the atmosphere. And so research on those kinds of things, we don't really understand those problems very well now. But it's something that I think all the Arctic nations, including US and Russia, have an interest in, and is another possible way of starting cooperation.
Okay, thank you. Well, we're sort of reaching the end of the hour, but one last sort of question, quick lightning round, asking you all about your views about Arctic governance. Do we see some new treaty on the horizon? Do you see that the Arctic Council is going to mature into some other form of regional governance institution, or are there existing environmental treaties which will be able to supplant some protocols around the Arctic? So let's quick lightning round on that, and then I'll hand it over to Raleigh. Roman?
Is there going to be a treaty, or what the prospects for a treaty? I seriously doubt it. Yeah, I don't think that there is enough momentum for a treaty. In terms of the governance, we need to find a different word, and we need to translate it better to Russian, actually, because the last time I heard this word been discussed in Russian, it was I think misinterpreted, and the Russian ambassador at large was going on and off about how there's no such thing as governance in the Arctic, because essentially they equivocated the term with the word management. So do I think that we need to enhance the current system of governance and preserve the Arctic Council? Absolutely. If anything, it has been, maybe not an ideal model, but still a working model for collaboration. We all know the saying, the old saying, right? So that the bad peace is better than a very good war. So I think if there are improvements to the current system, they should be made in the current, incrementally and within the current framework.
Great, thank you, Tony. Your thoughts on Arctic governance? Yes.
Yeah, I'm pretty hopeful. I think there's a good opportunity there. The Arctic Council is made up of member nations that have a common border with the Arctic Ocean, but there are a lot of other countries around the world, including Brazil and India, that are pretty far removed from the Arctic, that have an interest in what's going on in the Arctic and are trying to be observers and participate in the Arctic Council. So I think that there's a good chance that the Arctic Council can bring together a lot of global cooperation.
Okay, thank you. Rebecca?
I would agree. I think the Arctic Council has, it's been an exemplar of governance, and I would say partly because it gives such a privileged role to the indigenous communities of the Arctic. It's really unique in terms of international institutions because the indigenous organizations of the Arctic, the permanent participants, sit at the table and take full part in the discussions, and that's remarkable, and certainly an important part of the success of the Arctic Council. And the structure of the Council manages to balance between the interests of the Arctic states, which feel a certain amount of proprietary influence in the region, as well as the interests of non-Arctic states who can participate as observers. So I think that sort of mediates those interests fairly well. And in just the last decade, less than a decade, the Arctic Council has supported the agreement of multiple international agreements. So the Search and Rescue Agreement, the Marine Oil Spill Prevention and Response Agreement, the Scientific Cooperation Agreement. So we have a tremendous track record in recent years of binding international treaties and agreements negotiated under the auspices of the Arctic Council. We'll probably have one soon on black carbon. And so I think there is definitely a lot of positive work accomplished by the Arctic Council. It's a really important part of protecting the Arctic and maintaining peace and stability in the region.
Wonderful. Well, on that hopeful note, I'll turn it over to Raleigh to wrap up. Thanks to the audience for really insightful questions and great discussion. Raleigh, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Ali, and thank you to our panelists for a really insightful discussion. Before I close off, I would like to put in a plug for a couple of our upcoming events, including one this coming Thursday morning, April 8th at 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. We've got a discussion on the U.S. investment in the future of semiconductors and some of the threats posed by China and how this affects our national security. We'll be having our program director for Eurasia, Chris Miller, moderating that discussion, and this discussion is based on a recent report that we published. On April 12th from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m., we'll have a program on exploring extremism in Africa, and those of you who follow Africa will know that there's been a recent terrorist attack in Mozambique, as well as continuing kidnappings in Nigeria, as well as other incidents across the continent. We'll talk about what should the U.S. response be, both diplomatically and using other levers of national power, including the military. So on So we encourage you to join us for those interesting events that are upcoming. Again, our thanks to Dr. Saleem Ali, to University of Delaware for co-hosting this series. And thank you to all of you for joining us. Also, be sure and send us your feedback. We do read it and we take it into account. So without further ado, thank you again. Stay safe.
Thank you.